I rise to make a contribution to the Electoral Amendment Miscellaneous Matters Bill 2026. The bill makes a range of administrative and campaign finance amendments to the Electoral Act 2002 and some consequential changes to the Planning Amendment Better Decisions Made Faster Act.
Speech. I know there'd been a number of rulings on sort of political logos and branding for members of parliament, and I note the member's water bottle has a political party logo on it. I just seek your clarification on whether that is allowed under the standing orders.
I'll uphold the point of order. You may have, it might have been an oversight, but there certainly have been multiple rulings. Certainly by our current president and Mr Atkinson as well. So I think the item needs to be removed from view.
But here, President, as you may have noticed, I'm masked up with the flu. So if Mr Mulholland is happy I continue to rehydrate, I'm sure I can
it is a matter
keep
of whether
it
the
off
chair,
camera angle to...
It is a matter of whether the president or acting president is happy, and I'm happy with that.
Thank you, Acting President. Such small things that matters such as this can pivot upon. These reforms have already been fully explained by other members, and Legalise Cannabis have no issues with those provisions. However, the amendment to the Electoral Act 2002 that seeks to abolish group voting tickets without addressing the electoral form of the regions are deeply concerning. As they stand, these amendments will render it virtually impossible for minor parties, independents and new entrants, the fastest growing participants in the electoral landscape, to be elected to the Legislative Council. Instead, the reforms will effectively lock in the old parties, the Labor Party, the Liberal Party, the National Party and the Greens, parties whose primary votes have at best plateaued or more often are in fact in decline. Before proceeding further, I want to make it clear that Legalise Cannabis indicated our support for the removal of group voting tickets during the 2022 election campaign, and we have held consistent to that position ever since, and that remains our position now. So it's not about removing GVTs, but how it is done and what they are replaced with. And the provisions in this bill are both inadequate and they are undemocratic. In the 2022 election, roughly 28% of voters voted for a candidate not belonging to the four old parties. Labor polled at 33%, the Coalition at 29%, and then the next largest group was that 28% who voted for other than the big four, way ahead of the Greens on 10%. And that figure is growing exponentially. In 2014, it was 19%. By 2018, it was 22%. It is the strongest signal of the electorate's growing mistrust in the old parties. And it is happening both here in Victoria and it is happening nationally. So obviously this has been recognised as a threat by those old parties, and what do? They collude in a deal to consolidate their power and to eliminate those independent and diverse voices from the Parliament, the very voices that Ms Purcell was talking about in her excellent submission prior to my own. And in so doing, this bill validates the concerns of those very people who have lost faith in the major parties. They see the cynicism. They see the dirty deals being done dirt cheap. It might result in a good outcome for those old parties in the short term, but it is a tragedy for democracy in Victoria. And it may very well contribute to one nation holding the balance of power in the next parliament, as that 28% who would vote for alternatives to the old parties feel that they have no other way to express their disenchantment with the status quo. What's more, it's highly likely that this percentage will be even greater come the 2026 election. Now, there is no question that the upper house voting system in Victoria needs serious reform. During the 22 election, much attention was paid to GVTs, preference deals and payments to the preference whisperer, Glenn Jury. All major parties, including Legalise Cannabis Victoria, publicly supported comprehensive reform of voting arrangements in the Legislative Council. And in submissions to the inquiry into the conduct of the 22 state election by the Electoral Matters Committee, of which I am a member, the issue of voting arrangements in the Council came up again and again. And the inquiry suggested a number of ways that group voting tickets could be abolished while still retaining the diversity of voices in this Legislative Council, including increasing the number of members for each region, or having the same number of members but reducing or eliminating the regions and eliminating all members from the state as a whole. Victoria is, as we've heard ad infinitum throughout this debate, the only Australian upper house to retain group voting tickets. GVTs were abolished in New South Wales in 2003, in South Australia in 2018 and in Western Australia in 2021. But here's the rub. These jurisdictions also abolished their regions, allowing voters to vote in one statewide electorate. That is how a range of minor parties and independents are still able to win and retain seats in those parliaments. It might be irritating for the old parties, but it is a win for democracy. Heaven forbid that I preach to the politically savvy veterans of this place, but it's called proportional representation. And it may be politically inconvenient to the old parties, but it is at the very heart of our democracy. Acting President, is it not an extraordinary coincidence that in the 2022 election, Legalise Cannabis Victoria received about 5% of the vote, and we have 5% of the members in this place? The Greens got 10% of the vote, and surprise, surprise, they have 10% of the members here. And the numbers for the larger parties are likewise generally consistent with their share of the vote. It's a bit inconvenient. And yes, you can point to the micro-parties here as being overrepresented individually, but collectively they are generally numerically consistent with the remaining pool of votes that went to the dozens of micro-parties and independents. They have as much right to be here as anyone. Now, I would fully get behind an upper house voting system that abolished the regions as well as GVTs. Such a system has great merit and would give those 28% of voters an alternative for the major parties they clearly disdain. But this bill instead cherry-picks from the present system, abolishing the group voting system but retaining the regions and handing themselves, the old parties, the big parties and the other major parties, an unbeatable advantage. I listened with interest to the contribution of the member for Tarneet in the other place, the former chair of the Electoral Matters Committee, and he talked about the report's suggested two-stage approach. And he said, and I quote, "Get rid of voting tickets and get rid of them now. We do not have time to lose. Then let's come back in the next term and have a conversation about what the structure of the upper house looks like. That requires a referendum, and as we know, there is no time for a referendum between now and the state election. Please. This sudden urgency is so utterly contrived and laced with political opportunism. There has been ample opportunity and time to hold a referendum. Reform of the upper house voting system has been under consideration in this state since at least as far back as 2015. But nothing was done in 2015. Nothing was done when virtually the same recommendations that came out of EMC in 2022 came from the inquiry in 2018. And still, nothing was done. And so what we find is the big parties have waited until 1 minute to midnight to put up this bill, even though the VEC, the Electoral Commission, told them that time was of the essence 2 years ago. They have let the clock run down, knowing that it would force the separation of voting systems from regional distribution and a one-off political sugar hit. Or will it be one-off? If these GVT changes are so urgent, so utterly morally repugnant to remain in place, why was there no urgent action to stop GVTs from being used in the last City of Melbourne election, only about 18 months ago, where the simple answer to knowing where preferences go, apparently the heart of this issue, and it is a valid question. What was the response, Acting President? The acting response was that a booklet was provided with the ballot paper that documented the preference flows, and thus it was made transparent. But of course, we wouldn't want to take a simple and obvious and proven recipe. We would prefer to go the path that's being proposed here today. Seriously, does anyone really believe that whoever forms government after the next election, having rid themselves of these pesky minor parties and the independents, having pulled up the drawbridge to exclude those independent voices, will allow for their return? Who will be left in this chamber to advocate for its restructure? So will stage 2 of the reform process ever come to pass? Now, it has been argued, and it is correct, that we have recently passed Section 182 in the previous electoral reform bill, and that establishes an independent inquiry into the electoral regions and related questions. But we all know the fate of so many of these independent inquiries over decades, over successive governments of both colours. If the findings of those inquiries are inconvenient, they are either ignored or they are metastasised into some unrecognisable form. There is absolutely no requirement for any government to accept the recommendations of such an inquiry. I recently received correspondence from the father of modern Australian political science and psephology, Professor Malcolm Mackerras, and he said, and I quote, "No one seriously believes that there will be any second step. Instead, the need for a referendum will become an excuse to have no further reform and rely upon the assertion that this 2026 legislation was itself a genuine democratic reform. It is nothing of the kind." Beautifully summed. The only way to ensure that a fair democratic system prevails is to abolish group voting tickets and the regions simultaneously. To that effect, we will be supporting an amendment from Mr Borman during the committee stage to delay the commencement of the GVT reforms and to link it to the reorganisation of the regions. Democracy is and should be vibrant and dynamic, and sometimes it may be a bit messy. It's an inconvenient truth, for example, that strangely, despite a flood of publicity about Glenn Jury and GVTs and preference whispering in the 22 election campaign. And let's remember, it was front page on all the papers, it was in all of the electronic media. More than 90% of Victorians chose to vote above the line. 90% voted above the line, despite all of the crashing democracy, all of the threats that were published, all of the cries. The overwhelming majority of Victorians went with the system as we know it. And of course, the attack on small and emerging parties and independents is not limited to this bill. In the last electoral reform bill that I spoke about previously, 3 other changes were passed that significantly reduced the ability of citizens to form and operate smaller parties, and for those parties or independents to compete in election. Firstly, we saw an increase in the number of members required for party registration to go from 500 to 750, a 50% increase. Secondly, we saw increasing the number of people required to support someone to run as an independent for the lower house increase from 6 people to 50 to support that nomination. And thirdly, we saw increasing the requirement to have a completed party registration lodged with the VEC increase from 120 days to 180 days. I would also like to raise another issue with regards to the separation of voting systems from regional distributions. And Ms Purcell alluded to this before. We know that the Electoral Matters Committee recommended adopting the inclusive Gregory method in the next election. I'm not going to attempt to try and explain what that means, but it is a different way of weighting preferences within the count of the vote. And that change could not be accommodated because the VEC said it did not have the time to be able to do that. They could squeeze in the request of the big old parties to abolish GVTs, but they couldn't do the referendum and they couldn't do inclusive Gregory. Now, it is entirely possible that if a fulsome discussion around electoral reform does occur in the next Parliament and an alternate configuration is agreed, that may in fact necessitate further changes to the voting system. What a triumph that would be. 2 different voting systems in 2 successive elections, when it could have all been done in one hit if the voting system and the regions were addressed concurrently. Do it once, do it right. But no. Now, this question of rushing reform is not simply shared by those who will be crushed by it. Those who've been watching this debate will doubtless remember that in both the previous electoral reform bill and in this reform bill, a leading role has been taken by the Centre for Public Integrity. They are, I think it is fair to say, an impartial body. I think it is fair to say that they enjoy broad respect across the community. And if I may read from a media release that they put out this afternoon, the Centre for Public Integrity urges the government and Parliament to slow down the passage of the bill, release an exposure draft for public and expert consultation on its specific provisions, and ensure it is subject to robust parliamentary committee scrutiny before it is put to the vote. Now, that does not leave much to the imagination, does it? It's pretty clear where the Centre for Public Integrity is standing. And it is not simply, as has been suggested by some other speakers here, being put forward for improper purposes. There is real opportunity for reform of the upper house voting system that would bolster our democracy and possibly restore some faith in those voters who find the machinery of our major political parties abhorrent. But this bill is so contrived. It is so very opportunistic and cynical. And it's these very qualities that continue to drive the growth of new, smaller parties that speak directly to the people, often only a subset of the electorate, but people who wish to express their political preferences. It is our democracy. It is our proportional representation system. I fear that in the future, if this legislation goes forward in its current form, this will no longer be known as the Legislative Council. It will be the Old Parties Club. And the sign out there that says members only will have a whole new meaning. Now, we understand that the passage of this bill is guaranteed. The deals have been done. But nonetheless, Legalise Cannabis Victoria will not be supporting this bill, and we will also be pursuing changes to it. Thank you.